We've actually broken up our modeling roadmap into two parts. The first part is building the core three-statement model. As I've talked about already, really the three-statement model we're about to build really represents the core foundation of any sophisticated modeling exercise. There are 6 steps to what we're about to do. First is input historical data, and that is really about going to the Apple 10K, right? The Apple press release. The historical results is actually the easiest part. It's identifying what's already happened. And let me put up the model that we're going to start building. This is a little bit of a preview of coming attractions. In very short order, I'm going to say, okay, guys, open up the Apple 10K, and I want you to input all the historical results for the last 3 years for the income statement, as well as for the balance sheet. Notice, by the way, I don't really ask too much on the cash flow statement. We'll talk about why in a second. But first, we talk about inputting historical data. Then we start forecasting. And now, while we relied on historical results from the 10K and press release, etc., for historicals, we now have to rely on forecasts. As I said, we're not expecting you to be experts in Apple, which means we rely on the street case. In fact, what we're trying to frame for our first case is, what does the street think about how Apple's going to perform? And we rely very much on forecasts by JP Morgan. Of course, not all of them. But the first thing we forecast is the income statement. And there's a very important reason for why the income statement is what comes first. The income statement forecasts ultimately drive the balance sheet forecast. That's why it starts first. Let me go back to the Excel file, and you can almost see it even though we haven't really started the modeling. You can kind of see what we're about to do. We first forecast revenue all the way down to net income and EBITDA on the income statement. We use JP Morgan research to frame those forecasts. And then what's going to end up happening is much of what we forecast is going to drive the balance sheet. That's just a reality. So for example, accounts receivable, we're not going to come up with just a random forecast for accounts receivable. We are going to grow it in line with revenue growth. Now we're going to talk about why that makes sense. We're also later on going to build schedules that enable you to move away from that, say if you have a thesis on accounts receivable deviating from revenue growth. But there are some natural operating drivers that ultimately make it quite reasonable to first forecast the income statement using JP Morgan explicitly, and then use your own understanding of relationships between the income statement and the balance sheet to really drive the rest of the balance sheet. And so that's why we go first the income statement, then the balance sheet. Notice the last financial statement, the sort of core 3 are the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. We're not talking about forecasting the balance sheet. We actually call it something differently. We're going to derive the cash flow statement. And that has to do with the fact that the cash flow statement is a pure reconciliation of year-over-year changes on the balance sheet. In fact, if you scroll down in the cash flow statement, when I get you to start doing work on the cash flow statement, notice I won't ask you for any historical results because it doesn't actually, it would be redundant. All the work, historical work, is fully captured in the balance sheet and the income statement above it. And what's happening here is just a reformulation of changes year over year in the balance sheet to get to what's actually happening to cash. Now, those of you who took accounting, that's probably going to make sense. Those who are a little less comfortable with accounting, you're going to have to bear with us as we go step by step and talk about why that's happening the way it is. So at this point, once you build that, you will have built out the core 3-statement model. There are 2 things that we do have to clean up towards the end of it. The first is whenever you build a good 3-statement model, this is either, depending on how you look at it, either a feature of a good 3-statement model or a bug of a 3-statement model. And that is that the model it ends up being circular. And we'll talk about why that happens and how to deal with it, how to address it. It can be a problem. We want to also talk about how to avoid it if we want to, if we need to, right? So that's something we're going to have to talk about at the end. It represents a sort of a common issue in 3-statement models as well as other models. And then lastly, we will move away from the street case. So up till now, I've been talking about, hey, you're not an expert in Apple. We're just going to rely on JP Morgan and the street expectations around how Apple's going to perform. But the reality of it is, quite often, you are building that to frame what's called your base case or your street case, and then you move away from that by coming up with your own ideas about what might happen. What if things go wrong? Let's look at a weak case. What if things go well? Let's look at a strong case. So we're going to build scenarios and sensitivities around the things that we originally put into our model. That represents part 1.